We may be creating web pages, but this is programming, and no matter how good we get, we'll spend less time writing code and more time figuring out why the code we wrote doesn't work. JavaScript is a forgiving language, but there are still common problems to be aware of. And when you look at a page and it doesn't do what you were hoping, know that many JavaScript problems fail silently. There will be no error message, they just won't work. Although we can get some error message from some of our code, and let's cover those first. Make sure to have your JavaScript debugger like Firebug open, as the default configuration of most web browsers won't alert you to any JavaScript issues. They just won't work. I'm going to refresh this page. And with Firebug open, it's giving me a problem here. And this is the situation that first and most importantly, we might have syntax errors. So I'm going to jump over to Aptana. I've got a small JavaScript file that I'm using here with a few of the very common errors I want to show you. Most of it's commented out. I only have a few lines of active JavaScript here. First, and most importantly, you have syntax errors. Did you miss a closing brace, a closing bracket, or parentheses, or did you add an extra one? Because these and many more will interfere with any of your JavaScript being understood. One of the things you'll often see programmers do is when they're typing, say, if statements, they will actually type the opening and closing parentheses and the opening and closing curly braces before they then go back and start filling the things out, just to make sure that they're not messing it up. Now, if I have code and there's a problem with this code here, over in Firebug, it's actually saying I've got a missing colon after property ID. Now, that message itself might not be very helpful. And when you do see messages that don't appear to make sense, you just need to start looking at your code. Now, that's the message Firebug would give me. If you're using the developer tools in any of the different browsers, they'll often give you a different message. What I'm missing here is the closing parentheses after my function name. I'm going to save that, go back in and refresh the page. Now I've got an unterminated string literal. And it is complaining about a particular line. If I even click the line, it would take me straight to that. And what it appears to be there is another syntax error. I don't have the closing double quote. So I'm going to go back and drop that one in, save that, back over into Firefox, refresh the page, and I actually get the normal log message, which was what I was hoping for. But even after your syntax is correct and it's understood by the browser, there's still millions of mistakes that can happen. Let's go through some common ones here. So I'm going to just comment this code out, because we've solved that one, and talk about possibly one of the most common situations here. You create a function called, in this case, myFunction, and you call it, or so you think. If I save this code, I go back into the browser and refresh it, saying myFunction is not defined. This is one of the situations that will actually cause an error in any of the JavaScript debuggers. You're trying to call a function that doesn't exist. Whether that is, because of this situation, just a typo. I've called it a lowercase f for function when I'm calling it, but I defined it with an uppercase F. Saving that, we refresh that page, and everything's working again. So calling a function that doesn't exist, a very common cause of JavaScript errors, and very common also that you do a typo in some of the DOM methods, such as getElementById. In this case, this wouldn't work. If I save this, refresh this, I'll get a slightly different message. Document.getElementById is not a function. And you might be sitting there thinking, of course it is, I've used it 100 times. But of course, case sensitivity here. The D at the end of getElementById should be lowercase. It's giving you a slightly different message here because this is considered a method of an object rather than a function. Again, depending on what browser you're using, you may even see different messages for that. The equivalent of that with your own code might be that you say create an array, such as I'm doing here on line 29, and I'm trying to call one of the object methods here called reverse, but I spelled it incorrectly, and we're going to get that equivalent there. MyArray.reverse is not a function, which is of course true. So comment those back out, and moving on. Now, a couple of situations we've talked about before. One is if you're creating a variable and calling document.getElementById, but there's any chance that actual part of the page hasn't loaded yet, you'll only have an undefined variable here. This won't actually cause an error. Your code just won't work the way you expect it to. And that happens more and more as you get better with your code. You're not going to get those very obvious errors about functions not existing. It's just not going to work. Classic situation, of course, being this one. On line 41, I create a variable a equal to 10, line 42, variable b equal to 20, and then I have an if statement. If a is equal to b, or so I think. Now in this case, I think a should never be equal to b, but I'm doing the assignment instead of equality. So in my own mind, I would never expect this message to come out, but of course, this is exactly what's going to happen. Now notice there is no error message in Firebug because technically the syntax is correct, but I'm getting this console.log that something is wrong with the universe because we're doing assignment instead of equality. We are setting a equal to b here, not checking a equal to b. A mistake that all programmers in C-based languages will run into once in a while. We change that, swap back over, and I should have the message, this is what I expect, which of course it is. Now again, moving on to a couple of things that would cause errors in other languages, but don't officially cause errors in JavaScript, even though the behavior might not be what you want. Let's say this one, for example. I've defined a function called calculateSum. It takes 3 parameters, a, b, and c, and returns the value of those added together. Then a little later on, I'm going to call it. I'm going to call calculateSum, passing in 2 parameters and storing whatever comes back in my variable called result, and then writing out console.log result. Save that, jump back over into the browser. Now, this is not an error. All that I'm doing is writing out the contents of that variable, which is technically not a number. But I'm not getting any problem in the status bar. It's just an unexpected result, not an error, and those are 2 very different things. And of course, this is because I am allowed to call a function passing in less parameters than it was defined with. What's happening here is that C would be accepted as undefined. Then the code tries to add 3 together. If you try and add an undefined variable together, that doesn't make sense, so the result is not a number. Now, there are, of course, a million ways your code can fail, but looking out for these basic situations will clear up a lot of those core issues.